The words hung in the canyon air, a child's innocent plea against a history of bloodshed. "Mama, can we keep him?" At her feet lay the reason for her hesitation, a white man, wounded, wearing the faded blue of the cavalry that had made her a widow. Her daughter saw only a person in need, a life to be saved. But she saw the ghost of her stolen past, a symbol of the fire and sorrow that had defined her world. For the first time, she felt the pull of two futures, one of vengeance and one her daughter's hope might build. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you love Wild West stories. The silence of the canyon was a language Alawa understood, a language of heat and stone and the patient circling of the hawk high above. It was a silence that held memories, and today, it was broken by a sound that did not belong, the shallow, grasping breath of an enemy. He lay on the dust at her feet, a stain of dark blue against the red earth, the uniform a symbol of the fire that had consumed her world. It was the color of ash, the color of a winter sky that promised nothing but cold. Her hands, calloused from grinding corn and scraping hides, clenched into fists at her sides. Every instinct, every scar on her heart, screamed to leave him for the sun and the scavengers. A quiet, fitting end for the ghosts he represented. But then came a different sound, a small tug on her deerskin dress and a voice that was the only music left in her life. "Mama, can we keep him?" Nita's question was so pure, so utterly devoid of the history that choked the air between them, that it struck Olawe with the force of a physical blow. In her daughter's eyes, there was no blue coat, no cavalry, no vengeance, only a person who was hurt. It was the same look Nita had when she found a fledgling fallen from its nest, or a lizard with a broken leg, an immediate, unquestioning empathy that Alawa feared the world would one day extinguish. To Nita, this man was just another broken thing in need of mending. To Alawa, he was the embodiment of her sorrow, a living monument to her stolen past. Helping him would feel like a betrayal to her husband's memory, a forgiveness she had not earned the right to give. Yet, to refuse, to walk away and let him die, would be to teach her daughter a lesson in hatred, to place the first stone over the bright well of her compassion. The Delana was a physical weight, pressing down on her, rooting her to the spot. She looked down at the soldier, his face pale beneath a layer of grime and blood, and then back to her daughter, whose hopeful gaze held the power to shape a future. For the first time, she felt the pull of two different worlds, one defined by the bitter taste of vengeance, and another that might be built, piece by painful piece, by a child's impossible hope. The hawk continued its slow, patient spiral, and the canyon held its breath, waiting for her answer. Nita's question was left to hang in the heated air, unanswered by a word. Alawa's reply came as a sharp, deliberate movement, a grim turn of her head that was not an acceptance, but a postponement of fate. She would not let her daughter watch a man die. She would not be the one to teach Nita that some lives were worth less than others, even if every fiber of her being screamed that this one was. That lesson would have to wait. With the cold resolve of one handling something unclean, she knelt. Her fingers brushed against the coarse, sun-faded wool of his uniform, recoiling for a moment before gripping it tight. He was a dead weight, a heavy sack of broken bones and bad memories. She dug her heels into the dirt and pulled, her muscles straining against the burden. The soldier's body scraped over stone and scrub, a ragged sound that echoed the tearing of her own spirit. This was not an act of mercy. It was an act of concealment. She was not saving a man. She was hiding a ghost. With every agonizing step, the blue of his coat burned into her vision, a symbol of the life he and his kind had stolen from her. The physical exertion was a welcome distraction, a cleanse fire in her muscles that briefly overwhelmed the smoldering rage in her heart. She hauled him toward a deep fissure in the canyon wall, a hidden alcove veiled by brittle, sun-bleached creosote. It was a place of shelter, a place of peace, now tainted by his presence. Nita followed behind, a silent, watchful shadow, her small face a mixture of confusion and unwavering trust in her mother's strange, violent tenderness. With one last grunt of effort, Alawa dragged him out of the blinding sun and into the cool, damp darkness of the rock shelter. He collapsed onto the earthen floor, his breathing a shallow whisper in the sudden quiet. She did not adjust his position for comfort. She did not place a water skin by his side. She simply left him there, an unresolved dead in the shadows. Stepping back into the harsh light, she felt no relief, no flicker of compassion. She had merely moved the conflict from the open canyon to the enclosed space of her conscience. She had chosen to shield her daughter from one horror, only to invite another, far more complicated one into their lives. The choice was made, not from her heart, but against it, and it settled within her like a cold, heavy stone. Hours passed under the tyranny of the sun before she returned to him. A grim sense of duty, not kindness, held her back to the fissure in the rock. Nita slept in the shade of their wickiup, a small mercy that allowed this bitter task to be done in solitude. Alawa knelt beside the soldier, the cool, damp air of the alcove a stark contrast to the fire in her spirit. In her hands, she held a flat stone and a pouch of dried yarrow, its pungent, medicinal scent of familiar comfort from a life that no longer existed. She began to clean the gash on his side, a ragged tear through cloth and flesh. She worked with a detached efficiency, her movements precise and devoid of tenderness. The sharp, clean scent of the crushed herbs began to mingle with the coppery tang of his blood on the cleaning cloth, and the world dissolved. The cool stone beneath her knees was suddenly the hot, packed earth of her village. The quiet whisper of his breath was drowned out by a roar that was not wind. It was an invasion of the senses, a memory that did not ask permission. The night exploded in chaotic, poetic flashes of orange and red. Firelight, the hungry flames consuming the dry timber of her home, her life. The air, thick with the smell of burning pine and terror, was split by the thunder of hoofbeats, a rhythm of destruction that shook the ground. She saw it all not as a linear story, but as fractured moments of pure horror. The panicked whites of a horse's eye rolling in the flickering light, the alien shouts of the soldiers, their faces grim shadows under wide-brimmed hats, the splintering crash of her own lodge door, and the blue, the terrible, suffocating blue of their coats, a moving wall that swallowed everything good. She felt the ghost of her husband's hand gripping hers, his voice a desperate, forgotten sound before he was pulled away into the maelstrom. It was a memory of heat, of smoke that choked the soul, of a final, tearing loss that left a wound that would never heal. A low groan, thick with pain, came from the man in front of her. The sound was an anchor, dragging her back from the fiery depths. She gasped, her heart hammering against her ribs like a war drum. She was in the cave again. The yarrow was a green paste staining her palm. Her hand, which was meant to be applying the poultice, was trembling violently. She stared down at the soldier, at the uniform that was not a symbol of the past, but a living piece of it. The ghost she was tending to was the very same one that haunted her dreams. The act of healing felt like a profound betrayal, a sacrilege against the memory of all she had lost. Alawa retreated from the alcove, leaving the soldier to his fevered sleep, but the ghosts of the fire followed her out into the blinding light. She sat, watching the slow crawl of shadows across the canyon floor, her hands idle but her mind a storm of memory and rage. She had forbidden Nita from going near the fissure, not with words, but with a hard, unwavering stare that her daughter had always understood. It was a silent command, a boundary drawn around a danger Nita was too young to comprehend. But a child's compassion follows no such lines. From the corner of her eye, Alawa saw the small movement. Nita, believing her mother to be lost in thought, took a small clay cup, filled it with water from their dwindling supply, and began to walk toward the cave. Each step was soft, deliberate, a tiny rebellion born not of defiance, but of pure, unblemished empathy. Alawa's jaw tightened. She should have stopped her. A sharp word, a command, would have frozen the girl in her tracks. But the word would not form. She was paralyzed, caught between her fierce instinct to protect her daughter from this man and a deeper, more painful curiosity to see what would happen, to see if Nita's life could survive in such a deep shadow. Nita entered the darkness of the alcove, her small form disappearing from the sun. Alawa held her breath. The silence that followed was immense, a vast and heavy blanket. Then, she saw Nita kneel. The soldier stirred, a low moan escaping his cracked lips. His eyes, hazy with pain, fluttered open. For a moment, they were unfocused, lost in the delirium of his wounds. Then, they found the small face of the girl beside him. He saw the cup she held forward in her small hands, a simple offering in a world that had offered him nothing but violence. With a trembling hand, he reached out, not to take the cup, but to steady her small wrist as she tipped it to his lips. Water, cool and precious, trickled into his mouth. He swallowed, a pained, difficult motion. His gaze never left Nitia's. The moment was fragile, a whisper of humanity in a landscape of brutal certainties. When he spoke, his voice was a dry rasp of sand and dust, a sound that barely carried out of the cave, yet it struck a lower like thunder. Woven into the silence was a single, foreign word, gracias. It was not the language of the soldiers she knew. It was softer, a word from the lands to the south, a word of civility and grace. For a fleeting instant, the blue uniform faded. The enemy dissolved. The ghost receded. There was only a man, a child, and a quiet word of thanks that built a fragile, trembling bridge over a chasm of blood and hatred. The single word, gracias, did not bring peace. It brought confusion, a more difficult and unsettling emotion than the clean, sharp edge of her hatred. Allahua kept her distance for the rest of the day, a silent sentinel watching the fisherman the rock as if it were the den of a wounded wolf. She told herself she was protecting Nita, but she knew she was also protecting herself from the fragile bridge that had been built over the chasm of her grief. As the evening bled purple and orange across the sky, a new sound began to emanate from the cave. Not a groan of pain, but the restless, troubled murmur of a mind lost in fever. The words were disjointed at first, a stream of nonsense. Sand. Water. The metallic taste of a canteen. Alawa moved closer, drawn by a grim necessity. If he was dying, she needed to know. She stood in the mouth of the alcove, a shadow against the fading light, and listened. The fragments began to find a terrible coherence. He was not just rambling, he was pleading. And then she heard the name. A single, sharp syllable uttered in a voice thick with a fear she recognized intimately. Thorn. It was just a name, a sound, but it carried the weight of a ghost. The soldier, John, thrashed his head, his body tense even in its weakness. No, Captain, no. His voice was a choked whisper, the words of a man arguing with a phantom. The order, it was wrong. Thorn, you can't. The narrative of her hatred began to unravel. This soldier, this piece of the machine that had destroyed her life, was haunted by his own commander. He was not remembering a victory. He was reliving a nightmare. His breath hitched, a dry sob catching in his throat. He left me. The words were so clear, so filled with the desolation of betrayal, that they struck Alawe with more force than any bullet. He repeated the name again and again, a desperate mantra of the damned. Thor. 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 The name was a brand on his soul. Suddenly, the blue uniform seemed less like a banner of conquest and more like a cage. The man inside it was not a simple predator. But a broken thing. The mystery of his presence deepened, overshadowed now by a new, more sinister question. Who was Thorn? And what had he done to make one of his own soldiers speak his name with such absolute terror? The fever broke with the dawn. A cool, gray light crept into the canyon, chasing away the last of the fevered phantoms that had haunted the soldier through the night. Alawa felt the shift in the air, a stillness that replaced the restless energy of his delirium. Compelled by a force she no longer tried to name, she went to the alcove, carrying a small bowl of yucca root paste. She found him awake. He was propped up against the stone wall, his breathing still shallow but even. His eyes, no longer clouded with pain, were startlingly clear. They were the color of a washed-out sky, and they were fixed on her. The moment hung suspended in the cool, silent air. There was no sound but the distant cry of a hawk and the soft beat of her own heart. He did not speak. She did not speak. Words were useless things here. They were the tools of the world that had tried to destroy them both. Instead, they looked. He saw, she knew, the woman who had saved him, the woman whose people his own had wronged. But what she saw in his gaze was the true revelation. It was an unwanted mirror, reflecting a pain she knew in her own bones. She saw past the blue uniform, past the pale skin, and into the hollowed-out space behind his eyes. It was the look of someone who has seen the true face of the world and wishes they could forget it. It was the haunted emptiness of a soul burdened by ghosts, a look she had seen every morning in her own reflection by the stream. It was the quiet agony of being trapped, of being a single, powerless piece in a vast, cruel game directed by men like the one he had named in his fever, Thorn. In that long, profound silence, the carefully constructed walls of her hatred crumbled to dust. The blue coat was just cloth. The man was just a man. The true enemy was not the person in front of her, but the invisible hand that had placed a gun in his grip and a firebrand in another's. It was the orders given and followed, the lines drawn in the dust, the relentless cycle of violence that had caught them both in its teeth. They were from different worlds, born to different truths, yet they were both survivors of the same war, a war against the loss of their own humanity. He was a prisoner of his uniform, and she was a prisoner of her grief. The silence was not an absence of communication. It was a shared understanding too deep and too painful for words. He was the first of his kind to look at her and see not a savage, but a fellow captive. And she, in turn, saw not a monster, but a man just as broken as she was. The fragile peace born in the silence could not last. It was a thin sheet of ice over a raging river, and Nita was the one who saw the first crack. She was perched on a high ledge above their camp, a self-appointed lookout, her small silhouette etched against the vast, empty sky. It was a game she played, a way to feel important, to help her mother guard their quiet world. But the game became real when she saw the shimmer on the horizon. It was a tremor in the heat haze at first, a detail so small that only a child's patient eyes would notice. She called down, her voice clear and untroubled, reporting what she saw as she would report a passing lizard or a new wildflower. "Mama, there is dust." But Alawa heard the word like a death sentence. She scrambled up the rocks to Nita's side, her heart a frantic bird beating against her ribs. She followed her daughter's pointed finger to the distant plain, and she saw it. It was more than dust. It was a message, a warning carried on the wind, a smudge against the earth that slowly, deliberately, began to separate into individual shapes. Riders. The lazy, open expanse of the canyon, which for so long had felt like a sanctuary of solitude, suddenly transformed. The towering rock walls were no longer a shelter. They were the bars of a cage. The vast sky was not a symbol of freedom, but an unforgiving eye under which there was nowhere to hide. The pacing of the world shifted, the slow rhythm of the sun and moon replaced by the frantic, imagined drumbeat of approaching hoofbeats. Every choice she had made since Nita's plea now converged on this single, terrifying point in time. The moral dilemma was no longer an internal, philosophical struggle. It was here. It was real, and it was riding towards them wearing the same blue coats that haunted her dreams. To protect the man in the cave, the man who now had a name, a face, and a shared pain, was to actively invite the fire back into her life. It was to stand against the very force that had made her a widow and Nita fatherless. To give him up would be so easy. A simple act of self-preservation. A return to the clean, uncomplicated lines of vengeance. But when she looked back towards the fisherman, the rock, she did not see a soldier. She saw the unwanted mirror, the man with ghosts in his eyes. The dust cloud grew, no longer a smudge but a promise of violence, and Ilawa knew her choice would not be between right and wrong, but between two different ways of being destroyed. Ilawa scrambled down from the ledge, her movements a frantic, controlled panic. Dust and small pebbles scattered under her feet as she rushed back towards the shelter. The image of the approaching riders burned into her mind. She burst into the cool dimness of the alcove, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her eyes wide with the terror she had tried to hide from Nita. John was already watching her. He saw the truth in the frantic beat of the pulse in her throat, in the way her hands were clenched into white-knuckled fists. He needed no words. He pushed himself further up against the rock wall, his gaze following hers to the bright, threatening slit of daylight at the cave's entrance. He saw it then, the dust, no longer a distant smudge but a roiling, ominous cloud, a living thing of dirt and violence coming straight for them. A deep, shuddering sigh escaped his lips. A look of profound resignation, of grim acceptance, settled over his features. Then, he moved. It was an act of pure, desperate will. With a low groan that was torn from the very depths of his being, he pushed himself away from the wall. His legs, weak and trembling from fever and injury, buckled beneath him. He pressed a hand against the rough stone, using it for leverage, his knuckles turning white with the strain. Every muscle in his body screamed in protest. Alawa watched, frozen, her own fear momentarily forgotten, replaced by a stunned disbelief. She saw his intention as clearly as if he had shouted it. He was trying to stand. He was trying to walk out into the sun, to give himself up, to become a target and draw the fire away from her and her child. This man, this enemy, was attempting to sacrifice himself to save them from his own people. The act was so unexpected, so contrary to the brutal logic of her world, that it shattered the last remaining fragments of her resolve. He was not just a mirror of her pain, he was a shield against it. He managed to get one foot underneath him, his entire body shaking with a colossal effort. For one brief, impossible second, he was almost upright, and then his strength gave out completely. He collapsed, not with a slow crumple, but with the sudden, dead weight of a felled tree, his head striking the packed earth with a sickening thud. The sight of his selfless, futile gesture made her choice for her. It was no longer a choice. It was a certainty. She would not let them take him. She would not let his sacrifice be in vain. A new strength, cold and clear as mountain water, flooded her veins. The sound began then. Hello, distant rumble, like the sound of a storm far out on the plains. It was the sound of hoofbeats. It grew steadily, a rhythmic pulse that vibrated up from the ground, through the stone, and into her bones, becoming a deafening, terrifying thunder that promised to consume them all. The thunder of hoofbeats did not fade. It resolved. Out of the swirling cloud of red dust, 4 riders emerged, their forms hardening into a stark reality against the afternoon sun. They moved with a disciplined purpose that was alien to this land, a rigid line of blue and leather. One man rode slightly ahead, his posture ramrod straight, his authority an invisible mantle that settled over the canyon, silencing even the insects in the brush. This was Thorn. He dismounted not with the weary slump of a long-traveled rider, but with a single, fluid motion of predatory grace. His face was a mask of hard lines and shadows under the brim of his hat, and his eyes were chips of ice. They swept over the camp, missing nothing, cataloging everything. Alawa stood her ground before the fissure, a silent, unmovable stone. She felt Nita's small hand clutch the back of her dress, a tiny, trembling anchor in a sea of fear. The contrast was the physical pain, the cold, menacing authority of the man before her and the terrified innocence of the child behind her. He stopped a few feet away, the silence stretching until it was a thin, humming wire. He was not looking at her, but through her, his gaze dissecting her very soul. When he spoke, his voice was as dry and sharp as flaked stone. "You alone?" The question was an arrow. She forced the words from a throat gone tight with dust and terror, her voice low and steady. "My daughter and I?" A lie of omission. His eyes flickered to Nita, a brief, dismissive glance, before returning to Alawa, pinning her in place. "Seen a soldier. Wounded." The words were clipped, stripped of all courtesy. Another arrow. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drum against the slow, deliberate beat of the approaching hooves. She had to hold his gaze. She had to become the stone she stood before. No. The word was small, fragile, yet it was the only weapon she had. A lie of pure defiance. He did not react. He simply watched her, his stillness more threatening than any shout. He saw everything. The small fire pit, the sleeping mats, the clay pot with the remnants of their morning meal. His gaze was a physical touch, cold and sharp, tracing the invisible lines of their life here. And then his eyes moved, slowly, deliberately, past her shoulder, to the dark, shadowed opening of the fissure in the rock. A flicker of something, not surprise, but confirmation, passed through his cold gaze. He knew. The silent standoff was over. The hunt had reached its scent. Thorn offered no reply to her lurch, only a faint, dismissive curl of his lip. With a flick of his wrist, he motioned his men forward. They moved around her, their presence a suffocating wall of blue wool and oiled leather, pushing her aside from the entrance of the fissure. The captain stepped into the darkness, disappearing for a moment that stretched into an eternity. Then, he emerged, dragging the limp form of John out into the unforgiving sunlight. He threw him to the ground like a sack of grain, the soldier's head lolling in the dust. John blinked, his eyes struggling to focus, until they landed on the polished boots of the man standing over him. Thorne's voice was a low, venomous sneer, meant for John but loud enough for all to hear. A simple word meant to condemn. Deserter. From the ground, a different story emerged. John pushed himself up onto one elbow, a monumental effort that sent tremors through his entire body. His voice, when it came, was a ragged whisper, yet it cut through the canyon's silence with the sharp edge of truth. No, not desertion. His gaze lifted, locking with Thorne's. Abandonment. The accusation hung in the air, heavy and obscene. John's breath hitched, but he forced the words out, each one a stone cast against his commander. You left me. Because I wouldn't follow the order. Thorne's face remained a mask of stone, but a subtle tension tightened the jaw of one of the other soldiers. The scene held its breath. Alawa watched, her own story forgotten, consumed by this new, unfolding drama. John's voice gained a sliver of strength, fueled by the fire of a righteous memory. The raid on the lodges by the creek. The words struck Alawa like a physical blow. Her mind fractured. The canyon dissolved, replaced by a chaotic, poetic memory. The smell of pine smoke, the sound of rushing water from the creek behind her home, the desperate shout of her husband's name. It was the same creek, the same raid. John's next words became a voiceover to her own memory, a terrible, clarifying echo from the past. He told us to fire on them all, on the women, the children hiding in the lodges. The mystery was solved in a single, devastating moment of collision. The ghost that had haunted her, the fire that had consumed her world, and the man who had whispered Thorne's name in fevered terror were all part of the same terrible tapestry. The soldier she had reluctantly saved was the one man in the blue coat who had said no. He had chosen humanity in the very heart of the massacre that had destroyed hers. The narrative threads of her life, her grief, her hatred, her daughter's plea, all pulled taut, converging on this broken man in the dust. He was not the cause of her pain. He was a casualty of the same brutal command. John's words fell into a void of stunning, absolute silence. The accusation was a living thing, a poison that seeped into the air and began to work on the men in the blue coats. A law was so it happened not as a sudden storm, but as a slow, internal collapse. The two soldiers standing behind Thorne did not move, yet everything about them changed. One, a man with a weathered face and weary eyes, let his gaze drift away from John, unable to meet the raw truth of the moment. His hand, which had been resting on the butt of his pistol, now hung limply at his side. It was a small gesture, but it was a surrender. The other soldier, younger, barely a man, flinched as if he'd been struck. His eyes darted from John's ragged form to Thorne's rigid back, a silent, frantic search for an anchor of certainty in a world that had just been torn from its moorings. The captain's authority was a spell, and John's testimony had broken it. Thorne, sensing the shift, the sudden evaporation of his power, turned his head slightly. A muscle twitched in his jaw. He tried to reclaim the moment with the sheer force of his will, his voice a low, dangerous growl. Get him on a horse. We're leaving. But the command was hollow. It was an order given to men who were no longer listening. The younger soldier looked at the captain, his face a canvas of dawning horror and moral conflict. He did not move. This was the fracture. It was not a gunshot, not a rebellion, but a simple, profound stillness. The refusal to obey. Thorne was an emperor with no subjects, a wolf whose pack had suddenly remembered he was just a wolf. He was not defeated by Allah's strength or John's resistance, but by the weight of his own cruelty finally being held up to the light for his own men to see. The truth was the only weapon needed. The resolution was not one of victorious cheers, but of a quiet, bittersweet implosion. Thorne stood utterly alone, isolated by his own actions, his power revealed to be nothing more than the fear he inspired. And the fear was gone, replaced by disgust. He had been subdued not by a rope or a gun, but by the quiet judgment in the eyes of the men he commanded. It was an inspirational, yet deeply complex victory, where the battle was fought and won within the souls of the enemy themselves, a testament to the fact that even in the harshest of lands, some orders are too heavy to carry. There was no final confrontation, no dramatic exit. There was only the quiet, shuffling sound of men whose purpose had been broken. The younger soldier helped John to his feet, a gesture of support that was also a declaration of allegiance. Thorn, his face a mask of cold fury, was mounted by his weary-eyed subordinate, his authority now nothing more than a ghost. They rode away not as a confident patrol, but as a fractured group of men carrying a heavy, unspoken shame. The sound of their hoofbeats faded, a slow retreat of thunder that left behind a silence more profound than the one it had shattered. Alawa, Nita, and John were left in the long shadows of the late afternoon, three survivors of the war that had no clear victor. The future was a vast, unwritten page. John was still weak, a blue-coated question mark in the heart of their lives. He was neither enemy nor friend, but something far more complicated, a living testament to the fact that the world was not made of simple, clean lines of hatred. Alawa looked at him, and for the first time, felt no conflict, only a quiet, aching weariness, and the faintest glimmer of something new. That night passed in a silent vigil. Alawa attended to his wounds again, but this time her hands did not tremble with in memory of fire. They moved with a steady, certain purpose. Before the sky began to lighten, she took Nita by the hand and led her to the high ledge, the same place where their world had threatened to end. They sat together, wrapped in a single blanket, and watched the darkness. A thin, gray line appeared first, a tear in the fabric of the night. Then, a tentative blush of rose and pale gold began to bleed across the horizon, pushing back the shadows, chasing the last of the ghosts from the deep corners of the canyon. The first ray of sunlight struck the highest peak, a brilliant spear of light that set the stone ablaze. Slowly, majestically, the light descended, spilling down the canyon walls, turning the red rock to fire and the dust to gold. It was a promise, a baptism, a new day, born from the ashes of the old. The light washed over them, warm and clean, and in that moment, the world felt vast not with threat, but with possibility. The cycle of pain had been broken by a child's simple question and a single, difficult choice to see a person instead of a uniform. In a world carved by vengeance, what seeds will you choose to plant? Help us tell more stories from the quiet frontier. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell. You'll be the first to know when the next chapter arrives.